Talk about the oral history of Aylesbury, and let's listen to Michael.
Thank you, Aisling. Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm not going to give a comprehensive history of the Aylesbury because that would just take far too long. But instead, I'm going to talk briefly about three moments in the history of the estate that will give more context to some of the themes that are depicted in the rooms in the exhibition, and that will hopefully illustrate how we arrived at this moment in which the Aylesbury and council estates across the country, how residents of the Aylesbury and of council estates across the country have been or in the process of being dispossessed of their homes and communities. So firstly, going back to 1974, there was an American architectural theorist named Oscar Newman who presented a BBC documentary on large-scale modernist housing called The Writing on the Wall. And it's on YouTube if you want to watch it. It's quite an interesting documentary. And in it, the Aylesbury estate features heavily. Newman and his particular brand of architectural determinism were on the rise at this point, thanks in large part to his 1972 work, Defensible Space, which was a study of public housing in New York at the time. And so in a nutshell, the book argued that a trinity of design factors, anonymity, lack of surveillance, and the prevalence of alternative escape routes conjured criminality and delinquency among residents and further attracted intruders, addicts, and unwanted outsiders into these spaces. In short, the book was an uncompromising attack on the high-rises, slab blocks, and elevated walkways of the modernist estate. And certainly in the BBC documentary, the overall impression Newman conveys of the Aylesbury is one of menace and imminent danger. Now, it's important to note that the construction of the estate was still ongoing at this point, and the Aylesbury was only partially inhabited. And yet Newman's closing remarks, which were spoken as a kind of lament, implied in no uncertain terms that architecture has the capacity to undermine the processes of socialisation. So he said, and I'm quoting Newman here, "It's very difficult to believe that children who grow up here will grow up feeling any sense of responsibility, any sense of a role in society, any sense of a contribution they can make. One wonders, will these children grow up to become the criminals that we seem to have so much of in America in such abundance?" So Newman's words were obviously ridiculous, hyperbolic, sensationalistic, pathologizing, classist, and in the American context, racist. But unfortunately, they're very important in framing how people understood and ascribed meaning to large-scale estates like the Aylesbury. They were also related to and dialogic with the kind of slightly gentler broadside against post-war urban renewal that was taking place in Britain at the time, which often framed comprehensive redevelopment, such as that which was taking place in Southwark, as an irreparable rupture in the fabric of so-called traditional working-class communities. As many of these critics argued, slum clearance was an act of cultural vandalism, disrupting time-honoured patterns of social life and extinguishing any sense of community spirit. So what did this mean for the Aylesbury? At the estate's topping out ceremony in September 1976, so this was its official opening, Southwark's then housing chief, Alderman Charles Sawyer, declared that the Aylesbury development would be the last of its kind in the borough. "We have learnt from our mistakes," he said. Covering the estate for the South East London Mercury, a reporter named Roy Cooper said that the Aylesbury was the greatest housing disaster in the country, and he went on to describe the estate as a nightmare, an atrocity, and a monstrous hell. So from a position of relative approval or even esteem in the 1950s and 60s, council housing, which at the time was seen as a major solution to the postal housing problem, was now being redrawn through narratives such as Newman's as a major problem in itself. The Aylesbury and estates like it will be labelled forevermore as spaces of failure, of hopelessness, of violence and blight. These were the so-called slums, new slums, the slums of the 70s, the concrete jungles, the high-rise horrors. Contemporary capital-led processes of urban development, including so-called regeneration and social cleansing, take shape in incremental dispossessions of communities and places. But these processes are also underpinned and legitimated by narratives and representation. By reducing the estate at its very inception to a symbol of failure and inevitable criminality, narrative and representation created the necessary space for the forces of capital to unfurl. Which leads us to our second moment, which, jumping ahead 20 years, is Tony Blair's now infamous visit to the estate following New Labour's election victory in 1997. The Aylesbury has received more than its fair share of notable visitors over the years. In March 1986, Prince Charles, now King Charles, and a group of architects and academics drove safari-like through the estate in a battered orange minibus. One of the academics was a woman called Alice Coleman, who was Britain's standard bearer for Oscar Newman's determinist cause, and a key figure behind the council's decision to dismantle much of the Aylesbury pedway system of bridges and walkways in the 1990s. In 1999, it was the turn of Charles's son, Prince William, who was accompanied by a batch of his Eton classmates as they toured through the estate. And then there's the long list of leaders of the opposition. So Neil Kinnock, Michael Howard, David Cameron, Ed Miliband, they all found time to stop in at the estate and look aghast for the cameras. But by far the most famous visitable was that of Tony Blair on the 2nd of January 1997. Just elected, he delivered his maiden speech as Prime Minister on the estate in an IT training centre in Wendover block, so the block we're in now. And he was later photographed smiling and waving from an external staircase just below us from here, which, according to a report in The Independent, had been specially perfumed for the occasion. And there's a photograph of Blair on the walkway just at the front door. In his speech, Blair used the estate as both a rhetorical and visual backdrop to outline a sweeping vision of urban renewal. He described residents of the Aylesbury as forgotten people and implied that the illegal drug industry was the biggest employer on the estate. Invoking language favoured by 19th century moralists, he projected blame on residents for their own situation. His speech also inevitably contained a spatial dimension, linking so-called problem people to so-called problem places, not least of which were so-called crime-ridden housing estates like the Aylesbury's. But it wasn't just Blair. Speaking that same year, MP for Camberwell and Peckham and then Minister for Social Security, Harriet Harman, waded into this imagery of spatial segregation. She said, and I'm quoting again, "There are some estates in my constituency where the common currency is the gyro and the twilight world of drugs, and where relentless antisocial behaviour grinds people down. They inhabit a world where income is derived from benefits, not work, where school is an option, not a key opportunity, and where the dominant influence on young people is the culture of the street, not the values that bind families and communities together." In the span of just a few short years, Harman had gone from defending her Southwark constituents against, in her words, extremely unfair Tory policies, to stigmatising them in blanket terms, and in rhetoric similar to that of Oscar Newman 20 years earlier. The notion of a twilight world or a parallel world drove estates like the Aylesbury ever further into conceptual relegation and suggested there was something fundamentally amiss with all people living within them. For New Labour, then, the council estate was an evocative metaphor for what had gone wrong and a useful grungy counterpoint to its shining vision of urban renaissance. In this sense, and like the discourse surrounding the opening of the estate, it was language and not reality that fixed the estate with meaning, and it was language, not reality, that saw Project Renewal, in the form of regeneration, drive inexorably forward. Needless to say, the vision Blair set out augured profound change. And roughly 2 years after his Aylesbury speech, residents started to receive leaflets through their doors spelling out Southwark's plans for regeneration, including comprehensive demolition and stock transfer. Which leads us to our third moment, which was Southwark's ignoring of the stock transfer ballot in 2001, which is illustrated really well in the hallway. I'm sure you've had a chance to look at it. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the history of stock transfer before we get to the overturning of it in 2005. So in 1985, housing associations accounted for just 13% of the nation's social housing stock. Municipalities like Southwark owned the rest. By 2007, the number had swelled to half, and by 2012, it had leapt ahead. So 2.4 million homes versus 1.7 million that remained in council hands. And stock transfer was the instrument that made this dramatic shift possible. It was legislated for in the 1985 Housing Act, and the first wave of stock transfers began in earnest in 1988 in predominantly rural and predominantly conservative districts. Aptly for us, the district of Chiltern in Buckinghamshire was the first council to shed its stock, which is nearly 5,000 of its homes. And for those of you who don't know, Chiltern was a large block on the estate which was demolished in 2017, I think, and was one of the sites of occupation. I think it's one of these blocks here. Anyway, the stock transfer process only accelerated after 1997, but with an added urban dimension. So in this period in London, we see a dramatic rise in the number of large-scale stock transfers. Finance was always the pretext. The idea that council estates could only be improved through transfer out of the public sector. Borrowing for improvements, on the other hand, was ruled out of the question. Of course, there was no necessary link between investment and stock transfer. Rather, it was just a device for driving through privatisation. Built into stock transfer were two significant peculiarities. First, that local councils themselves had to initiate the process, and second, that progress was contingent upon a positive tenant ballot, which was a clause, as writer James Meek pointed out, that was grudgingly added after parliamentary pressure. What materialised then was a situation in which councils were exhorted by government to dump their estates, and tenants were exhorted by councils to vote in favour of being dumped. Yes campaigns got public money, no campaigns didn't. It was made clear to tenants that a yes vote would result in money being found quickly to renovate their homes, while a no vote would put refurbishment in doubt. The game was clearly rigged, but the results were often surprising. Nationally, a quarter of transfer ballots were rejected by tenants, while in London the rate was a third, Aylesbury dramatically included. So in 2001, 73% of tenants voted against the transfer of their homes to the private sector, on a massive 75% turnout. This was unquestionably a significant setback for the council, and considering it had hoisted the Aylesbury atop a public platform, one that left the government red-faced. In this sense, while campaigners were obviously relieved and elated in the moment, they also knew that this wasn't the end of it. Indeed, just a few months later, Nicholas Taylor, who headed up Southwark Land Regeneration, which was the council's partner in development, said he intended to, quote, press on with transfer to the private sector. And he further implied that 73% of residents did not fully grasp what they had voted for. For Taylor and many at Southwark, the realistic prospects of keeping the estate in council hands did not enter their computations, and fresh plans for demolition were tabled in September 2005. Just months before these demolition plans were resurrected, Harriet Harman stated, quote, the ballot vote must be respected with the whole estate staying with the council. Yet as tenants would soon recognise, a politician's assurances wouldn't stem the tide of privatisation. In Southwark, so the London Olympics were in sight at this point. The transformation of the Elephant and Castle was in the pipeline, and at this point, Thurlow Street had been identified as a strategic transport corridor in the Cross River Tram proposal, which was later cancelled by then Mayor Boris Johnson in 2008. But at this stage, Southwark's modernising trajectory, and at this proximity to central London, the commercial priorities were too great, and the economic opportunities too enticing for the estate to remain intact. Human considerations were clearly of secondary importance. As exemplified by the stock transfer ballots, and as this exhibition illustrates so well, this was a period of enormous tenant resistance, as a site steeped in history, lived experience, social meaning, and material importance was seized upon by the powers that be in order to gratify commercial appetites and fulfill political objectives. But despite this enormous resistance, the layers of meaning ascribed to the estate and to council estates from the outside were too numerous to cast aside. The narrative of failure, fixed from the beginning, was practically immovable. So lastly, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about how the voices, opinions and considerations of residents themselves were conspicuously missing from these three moments and the narrative surrounding them. So going back to the documentary, for all its ominous terror and its lingering shots of abundant concrete, the BBC film never truly gives a sense that there is something wrong with the Aylesbury. Amid Newman's dressing down, we see smiling faces, children running along ramps, a girl playing with a doll on a walkway. The estate looks clean and modern despite the grainy monochrome, and one interviewee, included presumably as a nod to journalistic balance, says of her new home, quote, "Well, it's heaven. Having a bathroom, having water, no up and down stairs with slop pails and water, kiddies can have a bath when they want it." By the end of the 1970s, upwards of 12,000 people have been housed on the Aylesbury, each with their own experiences and opinions of the estate. While typically obscured and marginalised by official discourses, it's only through listening to the voices of tenants does it become clear that these experiences and opinions diverge significantly with media treatments. Similarly, in 1997, for many tenants, including Ison, who watched the media commotion from her living room window, Blair's words were baffling and offensive. The Aylesbury he portrayed was unrecognisable. And in 2005, the decision to move ahead with demolition despite the tenant vote was top-down thinking at its rawest. It exposed the concepts of community partnership or community-led redevelopment, which was the pretext for regeneration under New Labour, for the gesture politics that they were. And it further exposed the disdain with which council housing and its tenants have been increasingly treated in the last half-century. So the voices of residents were overwhelmingly incidental to these moments and processes that I've described. But resident voicelessness is a central story to the history of council housing. It was and is part and parcel of being a council tenant, of being ignored by representatives and of being slandered in the press. In such a context, this exhibition positions tenants as an authority on their own lives and as unassailable witnesses in this struggle of historical meaning and interpretation, of which housing activists are engaged in daily. We do well to remember that at the heart of this struggle is something as simple and necessary as homes and communities. At a time when genuinely affordable housing is in short supply, private rents are at exploitative levels, housing waiting lists are growing, and homelessness is spiralling, this struggle is perhaps more important than ever. Thank you. Yes, I don't know if there's any questions or if anyone had any comments or... Yeah.
Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I was just wondering what the current state of play is of the estate.
I mean, Ison's the best person to speak to about that. Yeah, she knows it firsthand. I mean, the question was like, what's going on at the moment? Like, what's happening?
I live on the phase 2B, which I am the next, and they are trying to move us out end of the summer. They are in a hurry because if they wait for the next year, they cannot get the funding from GLA. So that's one of the other reasons they want us to move out ASAP. We are 30 of us still here, and none of us willingly wanted to move out. And let's see. That's all I can say, because I don't want to move out.
Yeah.
And what are the prospects of rehousing?
In what sense?
For the new places?
Oh yeah, I mean they made some council housing, so-called, which is on the first phase. You can see those, the high rises going on there. They are also dark. They don't even get proper daylight in, and very cheaply done. Also, everything has been designed in a way, if in the future you became a wheelchair user, the bathroom has been designed lower, and I am not, and there are people desperately needs that kind of places, and it is just no way I can move that kind of places. I told them my needs first, light, and then the high rise, so I can get daylight and sun. If they can find it, I can move. But other than that, I'm not going to bid for those cheaply made so-called council housing, and they just built those because of the mayor got involved, and they have to provide so-called some council housing. That was the only reason they built. It's just behind all of them, and you can't even shake the other building. The people is that how close they are, and the trees, the green areas we lost, and we are going to lose everywhere because they only want concrete all over, and then putting few plants, and then saying that look, we are green, we are environmental friendly.
They're lying. They're saying there's going to be more green. You know, in the council presentation,
But
officers' presentation, they said then, and we think it's so I've forgotten who. Some people are coming on Saturday, and we'll talk about this issue. That there's some independent survey who's calculated what the loss of green space is going to be, as opposed to the council office saying there's going to be an increase. You look at their diagrams and pictures, and you think how it doesn't.
With this exhibition, we are launching and asking independent surveyor, because what all along council is saying it is not safe enough. So independent surveyor to check our building and also check the newly ones and which one is the more strong and safe, then do accordingly.
The neglect is superficial.
Yes.
It's sort of like, so you know, you're going to hear constantly about repairs that aren't done. Improve your repair service. Improve your maintenance service.
The other people who lived in your block, have they moved into those flats, or have they been moved out?
These are just came 13th of April to be able to bid for 3 days. But the day we went to see the people, I haven't seen anybody living after seeing the flats, living happily, because it's awful. And the concrete bedrooms just put cheap carpet, and without asking me in my home, how dare them? And the whole building has been covered with the cheap carpet because underneath is concrete. So whatever the cheapest way, because they are after profit.
How many people here now? How many flats?
30
people.
occupant. Yeah.
Flats.
I think there's something important with estate demolition and rehousing, because obviously it affects the current council tenants, but then the impact on everyone else on the housing waiting list and on homeless families. Because what Southwark Council will do right now is they're going to find a beautiful house for Asen and they're going to bribe you to get you out. But then that property could have gone to, you've got your house and it's beautiful, and that property could have gone to someone else, like a homeless family on the housing waiting list. So what's happened to all the other tenants is they've been rehoused because they're council tenants. But that's meant that other people on the housing waiting list have been pushed further down. So homeless families in temporary accommodation have had years added to their time in temporary accommodation, because people who already had housing have been rehoused in other properties. And I guess as